In the chat box.
All right, hey everyone, it's Melissa from the Village Learning Place again. It is just 7:05, so we're going to get started. I will just mention right now, if you could keep an eye on your microphone and stay muted throughout the presentation, that'll just make it a lot easier for everybody to be able to hear whoever's presenting at the time. Okay, for now, I am going to pass it on to Greg, who is a board member at the Village Learning Place. And bear with me now as I am trying to, all right.
I think I'm good.
Yep, take it away, Greg.
Thanks, Melissa. So my name is Greg Bowden, and I am the president of the board for Village Learning Place, and I just wanted to take a second to welcome everybody here this evening, and thank you for joining us for our virtual Second Wednesdays program. The Village Learning Place is a not-for-profit library with programs for people of all ages located in Charles Village or on the internet. Previously, our Second Wednesdays were held in the library, but we are thankful to be able to do them in this virtual environment, which has the added benefit of inviting people in from wherever they might be. So if you would, as Melissa said earlier, please know in the chat where you're tuning in from. We'd love to see where everybody is situated. And if you're comfortable sharing your name or anything else about you that might be relevant, that'd be great. Our Second Wednesdays program is a free monthly cultural series that features lectures and presentations and special art events. And tonight's program, I think, is going to be particularly powerful and interesting, and I'm really excited to hear more. These programs are made possible by a very dedicated volunteer committee. I want to say thank you to them for sure, as well as donations from generous viewers like you. And we appreciate the opportunity to stay connected with you. And if you'd like to make a donation to support this program or the Village, you're welcome to do that. Last but not least, our Second Wednesday programs will be held virtually for the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, that is kind of the reality, but it's in the best interest of the safety and health of all of us. And again, we're just thrilled that you're able to join us here. Please visit villagelearningplace.org to learn more about all the programs that we offer. And I'm just going to pass it down to Melissa to introduce our speaker.
All right, thank you, Greg. And yes, thank you for your patience this evening, everybody on our call. I am also simultaneously getting to know this software as well. So tonight, without any further ado, we have Baynard Soderberg with us. He is a former editor of Baltimore City Paper, where he has spent his career covering cops, drugs, and protests in Baltimore. Tonight, the title of his program is I Got a Monster, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad, which is also the title of a book that he co-authored that was just released or published and released in July of 2020. So we are very excited to have Brandon here with us. And I am going to turn it over to you, Brandon.
Everyone can mute themselves. It's getting a little.
You?
Okay, cool. Thanks so much. Sorry to be a diva. Just because like losing my mind there. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me tonight. Looks like it's about 20 of us. I'm supposed to talk for about 45 minutes. I want to see. I would encourage everyone to start asking questions or concerns in the chat. that might also determine how long I talk and how long I give you time to answer for me to answer those questions. Feel like with a smaller group, it might be better to sort of get in the questions sooner. As Melissa mentioned, I have this book. It came out on July 21st. I Got a Monster. It's about the Gun Trace Task Force. I'm going to kind of go about this presentation as if you haven't read the book. Therefore, there will be a lot of spoilers, but I also will sort of unpack some things that if you have read the book, I apologize for being a little redundant. I want to start by, mentioning two things real quick. The first thing is that if you have read the book or interested in the book, next Thursday, myself, defense attorney Ivan Bates, who is a main character in the book, and my co-author Baynard Woods will all be speaking virtually with the Reginald Lewis Museum about it. And that's kind of just a really cool way to hear about the book from someone who's in it and who knows this world. His knowledge of this world is why we know this world. Ivan was a big source for the book. He's a major character in it. And additionally, one other thing I'll plug and then I'll shut up and get going is until August 21st of this month, there is an exhibition outside the Current Space that really ties to the book. And this is a exhibition in the windows of the Current Space on Howard Street and Franklin. One half of it is protest photography for a lot of great photographers in the city. And another window is a video installation that I helped put together, which is showing some body camera footage, some surveillance footage of the police, and some clips from the documentary that's tied to the book, which is will be out at some point. Was supposed to premiere at the Maryland Film Festival, actually, but the pandemic made that film festival not happen. And so this is a way to share a few clips. They're subtitled so you can see what's happening through the window. And there's also some footage that I'll reference in here because you could go there 24 hours a day whenever you want to watch it through the window and kind of see some of the stuff I'm going to talk about tonight. So yeah. Oh, and then last, if you haven't bought the book, I just encourage people to buy locally if you can. I won't shame anyone for buying it from somewhere like Amazon, but if you can reach out to a Greedy Reads, a Bird and Hand Ivy Bookshop, Atomic, Red Emma's, Charm City Books, that kind of thing. It's really not ideal to put a book out during a pandemic, but it's also great to know that by putting the book out locally, we can help support the businesses that I've been supporting for a long time. I'm going to begin with some kind of breaking news that happened today related to the task force that's interesting. Justin Fenton of The Sun, who also has a book coming out about the task force in February, which I'm really excited to check out, mentioned a story today that was there have been 2 police settlements related to the Gun Trace Task Force, which are basically 2 serious settlements between the city of Baltimore and people that were victimized by the Gun Trace Task Force. The first is a gentleman named William James, who has since passed away, but it was alleged and agreed upon by the city and his lawyers that he had a gun planted on him by these officers in August of 2016. Mr. James died earlier in 2019, but his family is getting a $200,000 settlement for what the Gun Trace Task Force did to him. Additionally, there's another man named Ivan Potts. Potts does not show up in our book because, as I'll discuss, our book is kind of really focused on a shorter timeline than the entire scope of the scandal, really the last year. But in early 2016, kind of right before our book begins, Ivan Potts was supposedly arrested by the Gun Trace Task Force and beaten. He's going to get a settlement of $400,000. So these are interesting cases because they are direct ways that this police brutality and malfeasance that went on for a long time continues to harm our city, because we have to spend money out to people that probably deserve much more than this amount of money, and there's no way to really rectify what was done. But this is an ongoing result of the Gun Trace Task Force. And Mr. Potts is interesting because he also was speaking out about what happened to him long before this was exposed. He filed some court filings of himself while he was in prison, kind of showing what had happened to him by these officers. And so Ivan Potts is an interesting example of someone who was one of the many victims of these officers who was yelling as loud as he could from jail about what had happened to him. So that's a good place to kind of just sort of think about that in terms of the ongoing ripple effects of this. And it is an ongoing investigation. I always stress that this is not sort of tied up in a bow by the federal government. They continue to charge and indict people for their role in this. So that's just something to think about. This has not sort of been cleaned up and organized. Really briefly, or scare quotes briefly. I'm sure I'll go much longer than I should on this. I want to kind of run through some of the main characters of it. Can everyone see a PDF? What are you seeing right now? Are you seeing?
Yes, Brandon, this is Melissa. I can see it. Let's say if you're having trouble seeing it, type in the chat, and I can try to assist you with give you some technical assistance while Brandon continues,
Sure.
if that works.
Sure. Sorry, I'm kind of bad. I'm bad at this part of it, so I apologize. But I'm going to run through these. And yeah, Melissa, I'm not seeing the chat while I'm in this thing. I guess I'm an idiot with this. So chime in if I screwed anything up. But I feel like you're seeing Wayne Jenkins really quickly. Really quickly, I'm just going to run through the major characters and some of the significant crimes in this case. Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, you're seeing a picture of. You're seeing his driver's license photo, which was kind of the photo that was passed around after he was arrested. Sergeant Wayne Jenkins was the kind of mastermind of the gun trace task force. He was their sergeant, and he kind of took the criminality that a lot of these cops were doing together and separately to sort of a whole other level. And he is serving 25 years in prison. He's an important figure in this because I don't believe that the criminality would have risen to the level it did without Jenkins. And as a sergeant, he was kind of in charge of these officers. His crimes included working with a drug dealer and bail bondsman, who I'll talk about before, and a little bit, who was dealing drugs that Jenkins was stealing. Jenkins was also robbing people, and he was in charge of these officers. And so he's just someone. He's really the kind of I hesitate to put things in this language, but for simplicity's sake, he's kind of the villain of this story, or the major villain. In contrast to him in some ways is Ivan Bates. Ivan Bates is a defense attorney who was really onto these officers pretty early. One thing that the book does, if you have not read it yet, is that it's kind of this upside down, inside out version of your normal organized crime story. We usually have the organized crime guys committing their crimes, and you have police and investigators going after them. There's kind of this cat and mouse game. Because of the strangeness and complexity of this story, we thought it was important to kind of look at who was exposing them for a long time, and that was defense attorneys. And so in a way, the robbers in our story are the police, and the cops are the defense attorneys that are investigating this. In some ways, this book is a tribute to defense attorneys, who are the people that are intimately aware of police malfeasance and often trying to call attention to it. Next you have, this is Donnie Stepp. He was a cocaine dealer and bail bondsman that was working with Jenkins and was moving a lot of the drugs that Jenkins and his squad were stealing from people and re-dealing it back onto the street. Stepp is currently in prison as well, and he was a major source for the book, actually. He spoke to us at length, provided us with some really interesting documents and insight into this, and he's currently serving federal prison time for this. But so, and you'll see this occur a lot, but 3 of these officers had a drug dealer they were working with in some way or protecting. Jenkins's drug dealer was Stepp. These 2 officers are Momodou Gondo and Jamel Rayam. Gondo was working with a crew of drug dealers in the Alameda shopping center. He was protecting and assisting in letting them deal heroin. And so that's the sort of second drug dealing crew that's kind of related to this. Rayam, below Jamel Rayam, was kind of a known burglar and robber. He had, who was working in the gun trace task force. He had rather infamously shot 3 different people in between 2009, and also around that same time had been in trouble with the police department for stealing $11,000. He was suspended for a year and brought back into the department. I'm trying to say these things all factually, but of course there's like a lot of rage one feels when you hear all this. But and then Rayam was working with a Philadelphia police officer, and he was dealing drugs with that Philadelphia police officer and getting drugs to him, who was then dealing them. And so there's also this way in which the corruption spreads. One thing that my co-writer Baynard and I have really thought about a lot is this idea that corruption is a kind of contagion. And I think we can think of that in Baltimore, where we have a lot of corruption from former mayors on down to police officers. And in this case, that corruption then spreads into other cities. that's just something to think about in terms of how this stuff spreads and how when it's not stopped or it's ignored or it's encouraged in some ways, it keeps getting bigger. This is Daniel Hersl. He's another one of the original 7 officers that was indicted on March 1st, 2017. I bring him up because he was Baynard and I's entryway into this story, and he also is an example of how limited the reporting that Baynard and I were doing turned out to be. You always want to do the best reporting you can, and I think we did some great reporting about Herschel's crooked copness, but we and a lot of other reporters had a cop or two we were paying attention to. We didn't see the larger picture. Hersl, we wrote about back in 2014 because he was using rap lyrics and rap videos as evidence against a rapper in the city named Young Moose, and was using that to keep this guy in jail, and really was harassing the family of Young Moose. Moose's family, we got to know them pretty well, and they started showing us videos of safes broken into and things like that. And so we were aware that Hersl was doing a lot of bad stuff. We wrote a few pieces about it. Additionally, D. Watkins, the great Baltimore writer, has an essay in his first book called The Beast Side about Hersl, an essay that originally appeared in City Paper. And then earlier this year, D wrote a really, really amazing piece for the website The High Line that kind of compares and contrasts his own life to Herschel's, and how D grew up as someone dealing drugs in East Baltimore and is now a writer, and Hersl grew up as a cop in Baltimore who's now in trouble for his in jail for his connections to a drug dealing crew of cops. I bring this all up because at the time Herschel's actions seemed incredibly egregious, and they are, but they're also really pale in comparison to what Gondo or Ram or Jenkins, who I mentioned above, were doing, which is really ornate and complex drug dealing. Some really wild stories about Ram breaking into people's houses, including one where he dressed like a mailman to break into someone's houses and rob people. A lot of things like that. And so there's this thing that's an interesting lesson for us as reporters, is that we saw one exceptionally bad cop, we thought, and in fact, we had 1/7 of a much larger story that was only really exposed once the federal government indicted these officers on March 21st, 2017. I'm going to run really quick through some notable crimes that they were involved in. I think this kind of gives you a perspective on the scope of it all. The first this is an image of a crashed car. This is in 2010. In 2010, Sergeant Jenkins and a few other cops, including Sean Suter, who, as we know, was later found dead the day before he was supposed to testify against these officers. Well, back in 2010, Jenkins and Suter, some other police officers, were in a unit. They pulled up on a man named Umar Burley, who they suspected as being a drug dealer. They got out of their cars. Burley says they got out of their cars with ski masks on and had their guns out. Burley, not knowing they were police officers at all, sped away. The cops then chased him. So they're kind of driving around a high-speed chase through West Baltimore. Burley runs a stop sign, and he crashes into a car that's driven by an older couple. His car hits the older couple's car, and it kills an older man named Albert Davis. And he's killed because of the crash. Burley is stunned in the car. He's not thinking. He's concussed. The police officers, Jenkins, realizes what he's done, which is he's caused a crash and chased someone. They search Burley's car before rendering aid to anyone, and they don't see anything incriminating in Burley's car. And so Jenkins calls a sergeant, who we still don't know who that is, and has that sergeant plant drugs on Burley. Burley did 8 years in jail for this. Now, this is important because it's a devastating story, but it's also important because this is partially what Detective Sean Suter was supposed to testify to the day after he was shot and killed. Without diving into the Suter stuff too much, I always try to tell people, Baynard and I did not solve the Sean Suter story. So if you're looking for the final answer on that, you will be disappointed in our book in that way. The debate with Suter is generally, was he killed or did he kill himself? Police investigations and a state police investigation have said that Suter was killed himself. Suter's family has continued to say what they call, and it was an inside job, meaning they believe police officers did this to protect them from what Suter was going to say. And as I just stressed again, Suter's death was the day before he was supposed to testify about these officers. This is an image of Sergeant Jenkins interrogating a man named Walter Price. I'm bringing these crimes up because these are things that have been shown or were known at the time, and so we get to see. The question is, how did they get away with this? Is a complicated one, but I'm sort of running through particularly egregious examples of crimes these guys did that were ignored at the time by prosecutors and police officers. The man here, Walter Price, was stopped in this van. They searched the van and claimed they found cocaine in the van, and then arrested Walter Price for the cocaine. What was revealed when this security camera footage was found by the prosecutor and the defense attorney was that Walter Price stood there, was placed outside his van for hours as they searched his car. What it revealed was that while the police version of events was they stopped Walter Price and then they very quickly found these drugs in his car. What was revealed by the surveillance camera here is that Price was actually there for hours. A lot of people came and went into the scene. And what was later revealed was they stopped Price. They didn't find any drugs in his car. Another officer broke into Price's house, took drugs out of Price's house, brought them to the scene, and planted them in the car. So now we have two cases where police officers are planting drugs on people. That's in 2014. Now this case is important because at the time, the fact that Jenkins lied was called attention to by the prosecutor to say, hey, this is a problematic case. Jenkins clearly lied. The security camera footage shows he lied. It doesn't line up with what he said happened. Ultimately, though, Jenkins did not get in any trouble for this. And as our book shows, Sergeant at the time, previous Commissioner Darrell D'Souza apparently sort of helped Jenkins out of this little mix-up that he was in. Not long after that, Jenkins was driving. He was with another officer. He finds a man named Demetric Simon, and Jenkins, for reasons completely unknown, not there's a justification for this, but there's never been an even adequate excuse, really. Jenkins runs Simon over with his car. Simon is then on the ground under the car. Jenkins calls the guy you see here, the bald guy, Sergeant Keith Gladstone, and says, hey, I just ran over a guy. You got a gun I can plant on him. Gladstone then calls some other police officers, and they find a BB gun, and Gladstone comes to the scene, and I will get to your question in a moment about Walter Price. We can dig into that a little bit. I saw that pop up. So what happens is Gladstone drops this BB gun under the car, and then the excuse becomes, Mr. Simon had a gun. I had to run him over because he was going to shoot at us. We now know that wasn't true at all. Gladstone was later indicted for his role in this BB gun planting, as were two other officers. And this is also in 2014. So again, you kind of start to have this planting, covering up crimes with planting evidence involving a sort of same inner circle of officers. I think that's important to consider. We're going to jump forward because I'm going to dig back a little bit to a more significant case. But real quick, this is kind of an example of I see as like the prosecutorial concerns with this example. This is in July of 2016. This is an image of Jenkins and Herschel laughing after they've robbed a condo in Canton that they said had heroin in it. They made their way into the condo with a faked warrant. Once they got in, they arrested the man there, and then they took a bunch of stuff out of his house, and they claimed they found a bunch of heroin in the house. The couple were arrested. What was revealed later after the task force was indicted in 2017 was it kind of threw this case up in the air, right? Because okay, so we have these officers that we know were doing a lot of illegal things, including dealing drugs and planting evidence on people. Well, why was the couple had still not been exonerated or their charges had not been dropped for the heroin possession? The argument at the time being, even into March after these officers were indicted, well, heroin was found. We need to prosecute this as a case. There was heroin in their house. What's the question? Of course, the question that I think defense attorneys were asking was, how can you believe anything when they faked a warrant, have a penchant for planting evidence, and including heroin on people, as they did with Mr. Burley in 2010. So it's kind of a small case. And then eventually, Maryland Mosby State's Attorney's Office did drop the charges against the couple for the heroin, but it was only after some uproar. And I bring that up because it's a central issue with this whole, how these officers operated, which was you often found people that were not to be believed because they had criminal records or were currently involved in criminality. And therefore, it was kind of anything you did to them was kind of fine because, oh, you found a gun on them or they were dealing drugs, and therefore they're not sort of we don't have to worry about these violations of rights. They're bad guys. And you really tried to look at people that were often not to be believed. This kind of is just a good example of that. The next one I'm gonna run through real quick is the arrest of Albert Brown. This is just a few days after the one I just showed you, the Canton robbery. Albert Brown was a Safe Streets worker. I think that's important because something that's really notable about these officers, and particularly horrible in my opinion, was that they targeted violence interrupters in the city. Baynard and I wrote a piece for The Intercept not long after the book came out in July about this specific a strategy of police officers targeting Safe Streets workers and arresting them. For those who don't know too much about Safe Streets, it's basically people in the community that are mediating violence and trying to figure out who's doing the shootings or who's going to shoot someone, try to get between that person and the person they want to shoot. It's been incredibly effective, and it's sort of looking at crime from a public health perspective. Brandon Scott is a big supporter of this program. So with Mr. Brown, they stop him. This is, for anyone who knows Baltimore really well, this is the gas station on Reisterstown Road by the Hip Hop Chicken, where you often see the dirt bikers on Sundays riding up and down. That's exactly where this is. They pull up on Brown for reasons we don't know, beyond the fact that they claim that Brown didn't wear his seatbelt when he pulled out of the gas pump. Brown said, I was going to, put air in my tires across the gas station. I was within the gas station. Why would I put my seatbelt on? Brown claims that they then searched Brown and found a gun and drugs. Brown claims those gun and drugs are planted on him, and he also claims that the entire stop was bogus. There are other examples of these officers using that exact same excuse, which is not wearing a seatbelt. We stopped a guy. Hey, he turned out to be a violence interrupter. Oh, and he turned out to have a gun. There's a man named LeVar Mullen who this happened to him in 2013, and he was in jail from 2013 to 2018. The exhibition I mentioned at the Current Space on Howard Street in Franklin has the full body camera footage of this arrest if you're interested in seeing it. It also has a short clip from the documentary where LeVar Mullen, another violence interrupter, discusses his arrest. So we're trying to find ways to provide this information out there in the world for you guys, for people that are interested to see and experience and kind of expand the journalism of the book. Brown, after they arrest Brown, they take him to his house, which is right across the street from the Western District Police Station. They don't take him into the police station. They break into his house across the street and they search it. This is all captured on body camera because Herschel had a body camera, forgot to turn his body camera off. When this goes to trial, it's exposed that the body camera was forgotten to turn off, and Ivan Bates, for lack of a better word, the kind of protagonist or hero of our story, calls attention to this. Again, you see this thing where prosecutors say, well, this is a story about an arrest at a gas station for somebody with cocaine and a gun. We're not really interested in what happened after that, even though in this case what happened after that is they broke into his house without a warrant and tried to rob him. And so there's this idea, there's a phrase the federal prosecutors during the trials for some of these officers used, which was, they were beneath the law. They saw people that were beneath the law. And so kind of the minute you're arrested for a gun or drugs, you are sort of seen as beneath the law, and your rights, as we've observed in watching a lot of trials, tend to sort of be dismissed just simply because you were breaking the law. Therefore, however they got to your gun or drugs is okay, and keep it kind of moving along. This is Andre Crowder. His story is really tragic, so I'm sort of warning people of that. Mr. Crowder was stopped in Cherry Hill. He had a gun. He admitted that on body camera footage. After he was arrested, the Gun Trace Task Force went to his house, got into his house where he lived with his mother, and stole about $10,000 from him. During the 3 days that Mr. Crowder was in jail, his 2-year-old son died. And so he didn't get to see his son for his last few days. I bring this up because that's just devastating, and because I want to kind of think about this again, this thing I keep pushing, that we see these people as beneath the law. And so in this case, this was ostensibly an arrest that led to a gun seizure that even Mr. Crowder himself admits, yes, I had a gun. But the premise for the stop in Cherry Hill was he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. In this case, it would have been nearly impossible to notice that because it was around 10:30 at night in Cherry Hill by a school. as we did with a lot of this book, we would go to the scenes of the crimes and events and try to unpack them. That's partially why you have a lot of detail in the book if you've read the book. And so again, you see this idea that they're arresting people unconstitutionally, making reasons up for stopping them, and then once they kind of get the gun, they retrofit it. And on top of that, they often rob these people. This is a still from some body camera footage of the arrest of Gregory Harding. Gregory Harding was stopped. He was chased by the task force in October of 2016, and he was arrested for having a bunch of cocaine. What then happened was Rayam, who I introduced earlier, was given some of that cocaine, and he used that cocaine to sell. And he did that because he owed Jenkins a debt. And so what you start to see is this unit kind of unraveling. They start to owe each other money, and they're getting really egregious with what they do. What you see in this full body camera footage, if you watch it, is you see Rayam take the cocaine from one of the officers, walk across the frame of the body camera, place it in the console of his car, and close the door. Again, if you go to the current space exhibition that's up right now, one of the videos is the 2 minutes of isolated footage, which you can see Rayam taking the cocaine and putting it in his car. We kind of did a sort of green circle around it so you can watch it. So I think these things are really important that you can get to see them. In the book, if you've read the book, there's kind of a long and complicated saga in which Rayam tries to get rid of this cocaine, and it's really hard. So it's kind of another example of these officers stealing and dealing drugs. And I would stress that defense attorney Ivan Bates, when he testified before the police accountability work group tied to investigating why the gun trace task force happened, Bates, who also had this case, claimed that Harding, who was killed in late 2019, was killed because of a drug debt as a result of this cocaine. Another man in the book named Davon Robinson was robbed of $10,000 and was later shot and killed because he couldn't pay a drug debt. And so another thing that I've been really stressing is there's the crime that these officers committed, and then there's the crimes that they created, the sort of expansion, the concentric circles of crime they create. So we have at least 2 examples of officers robbing people, and then street justice coming in and having these people killed. And I just sort of stress that, because when you put that on top of the other things I've described, or even like the targeting of violence interrupters, you get a really a kind of intangible amount of crime that they created and led to, including homicides. And so Baynard and I have done a couple op-eds lately about the book, and one we really tried to stress that sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy where these officers who are creating crime and creating violence, and then you argue that you need to go out there and have a longer leash to stop crime and be aggressive because there's so much crime, but it's crime you created. In a way, I think that's something of a metaphor for how the police department here often works, which is we're asked to give them more and more leeway the more crime they created. The more crime that happens, the more we have to give them more money. We have to give them more, allow them to be more aggressive on the streets, which creates more crime. There's a lot of questions, which is super great. I'm going to try to get to them soon and shut up. I'll shut up, I mean. So real quick, I just want to mention 2 other characters. As I think I've kind of discussed, like defense attorneys are kind of seen as the people that are really exposing this stuff. They're in a very complicated position, though, because the role of a defense attorney is to defend their clients. It's not to prosecute dirty police officers. But often they could use the information about dirty police officers to sort of show that their client was stopped illegally or illegally detained or other problems with the case. So the book is dedicated to all attorneys that are sort of fighting for the 4th Amendment, which is, right to reasonable search and seizure, which these officers violated daily. One is public defender Deborah Katz-Levy, and the other is former public defender and now private practice defense attorney Natalie Finnegar. In terms of scope, I keep talking about this idea of like how many crimes were created and all these crimes. Like Levy and Finnegar hear about the indictments pretty much right before I think the rest of the city did. Hey, 7 officers have been arrested for all this crazy, really extreme behavior. And Finnegar and Levy pretty much got right to work. As Natalie said to me when I interviewed her for the book, it was sort of a whirl of Coke Zero and Excel sheets in which they kind of dug through all these cases. So think about, you have 7 officers working together or separately over at least a decade, arresting people all the time, also working with other officers. And so the amount of potential cases that were now for question went into the tens of thousands. It's almost like psychedelic if you think about it. Suddenly, you think you understand how this works, and then you're suddenly hit with just an outrageous amount of potentially tainted cases. And that debate, or that battle, however you want to look at it, is still going on, where the public defender's office in particular is really pushing for a lot of cases to be on, to let people out of jail, and the state's attorney's office trying to go through these cases one at a time. What you did see in the aftermath of the indictments is a whole bunch of people, a few dozen people, getting out of jail because their cases were shown to be tainted by the officers. But that battle continues, and the question just becomes like, where do you draw the line with someone who should get out or not get out? Is the fact that they did commit a crime, but they're arrested by dirty cops, is that enough? Things like that. I mean, this is just still going on, and that's just kind of the scope of where we're at with all of these cases. And as I kind of described, you still have, since the initial 7 were indicted in March of 2017, 8 other officers have been indicted connected to it. It continues to be an open investigation. So it kind of keeps growing. And I think that's something that is very clear to me, is that the city hasn't really reckoned with the full scope of this. I always, something like, what's it mean that these officers were arresting violence interrupters, those kinds of things. So thanks for listening to that. I'm going to run through one more thing, and then we'll hit questions, which is, I want to just really quickly go through a brief history of what it meant, how the Gun Trace Task Force was created and what it meant. Really briefly, in the early 2000s up to about 2006 or 7, this was Baltimore was engaged in a really egregious and outrageous experiment in mass incarceration. This idea of zero tolerance, really brought in from New York and pushed by our then Mayor Martin O'Malley. The idea was arresting a lot of people for quality of life arrests, such as open container and things like that, to kind of keep crime down. This was challenged by the ACLU, mainly because one way to look at it would be that, I believe it's in 2003, but one of the years in here, I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact year, but on average, from 2006 or so, Baltimore police were making about 100 to 120,000 arrests in a city of 620, 650,000. It's a staggering amount of arrests. When you speak to public defenders, some of whom were public defenders at the time who then go into private practice, or the people that are really calling attention to what these officers were doing 10 years later, they would describe going into jail and seeing the jails overwhelmed with people for mostly bogus or small petty charges, like not wearing a seatbelt, like open container, things like that. And so what happens is, in 2006 and 2007, the ACLU says, hey, this unconstitutional and racist policing, so it's primarily targeted at people of color, Black people in Baltimore, needs to change. That coincided with Sheila Dixon becoming our mayor when Martin O'Malley becomes the governor. So Dixon was tasked with the issue of trying to get the police to police constitutionally, but she was also dealing with what at the time was a really high murder rate of around 300 or so. And so she had this dual role of, how do we reduce arrests, because we're arresting way too many people. The ACLU says we have to. And at the same time, how do we reduce the homicides? And so what started to come up was this idea of really looking at specific people. When you remember, if you were in the city or remember the news, you often hear Commissioner Frederick Bielfeld at the time talking about this idea of bad guys with guns. It doesn't do a lot of good to arrest all these people, even if it's for drugs. We need to arrest the specific people doing what they see as the worst crimes. And this has continued to be a strategy that's invoked. So you have this idea that rather than arrest a lot of people, you want to arrest the people that you see as committing the most crimes, especially shooters. Generally, it's understood that there's a handful or bunch of people that are doing a lot of the shootings. If you get those people off the street, in theory, your crime will reduce and people feel safer. That's how the Gun Trace Task Force was created. Bring this up. This is 2007 now. We're 10 years before they're indicted. I really want to look at this idea to think about the Gun Trace Task Force as just one of many police squads. It's not like it was an inherently corrupt squad, just all these officers ended up there doing a lot of dirt. But the main central idea of the Gun Trace Task Force was you're going to target people who have guns, who are selling guns, using guns to shoot people and commit non-fatal and fatal shootings. We need to get you guys off there. You're going to investigate them. That's literally the Gun Trace Task Force. You're going to trace guns to shootings, to dealers, things like that. Work guns like a drug case. This seemed like a great idea in a way, because it's this idea of, okay, let's not focus on drugs, which I think by the mid-2000s, we started to really understand the drug war didn't work. So let's focus on guns. We all agree, drugs are not inherently bad, but guns are, essentially. But what you see is that in this idea of targeting people, you really start to recreate the same problem of the war on drugs, which is you arrest the same groups of people for the same kind of thing. Just instead of arresting for the drugs, you're arresting for the guns. This was really great for dirty cops because suddenly the drugs weren't of interest anymore. So you arrest someone for a gun and the drugs aren't being looked at anymore, so you take them, you deal them. Since in the past year, I believe, past few months actually, another officer was indicted for his role in a major cocaine bust here that was really highlighted on the news, and 41 kilograms of cocaine seized. It was later revealed that he tried to sell some of that, and a lot of the money this drug dealer had was stolen. And but the focus here, I think, especially is targeting. And what you see with the Gun Trace Task Force as it gets into 2010s is they start to target people using the information that they were told. Hey, this guy's a shooter. We have this information. He's a major cocaine dealer. He's shooting people. We need to get rid of him, get him off the street. The Gun Trace Task Force and other dirty cops start to use that information to target these people for robberies rather than just arrest. And that's where this sort of moment of magical thinking, where the city goes, hey, let's stop arresting people for drugs. Let's start arresting people for guns instead, really gets really kind of mutated into this really extreme example of how you can target people, use police information against people, and rob them and also arrest them. Now, it's really the MO of the Gun Trace Task Force in one way or another. Get to someone for some reason that would put them in jail, and then use that to also rob them of some of their drugs or all of their drugs or some of their cash or all of their cash. That was really the move. And what you start to see as the book shows is that defense attorneys like Ivan Bates started to really understand that and started to call attention to it. And if you haven't read the book kind of begins with a really extreme case of this, which is a person named Maurice Stevenson, who was a cocaine dealer, is stopped because he was a cocaine dealer. They knew we were looking for him. They stop him. They get in his car. They arrest him. They take his keys. They go back to his house. And then they steal about $100,000 from him, turn in some other cash. He has 10 kilograms of cocaine in his basement. They hand in 8 and they keep 2 and they sell those 2. So that's where our book begins for a number of reasons. It's one of the most extreme robberies they did. They stole over $100,000 and 2 kilograms of cocaine. And that case ends up, without spoiling the book too much, keeps kind of coming back. And it's an Ivan Bates case, the defense attorney I mentioned earlier. And it's one of the cases where he starts to really realize what these guys are doing and really opens his defense attorney practice up to trying to bust these guys. So that's kind of where we're coming from in our book, and that's in March of 2016. And so our book is really focused on about March of 2016, when they robbed this guy for $100,000 and steal cocaine from him, to March of 2017, when these guys are indicted. And the last third of the book is the kind of fallout. These officers in jail, the ramifications of all these cases being tainted, as I mentioned, with Deborah Levy and Natalie Finnegar. And that's kind of the structure of our book, is really focused on this last year or so of their lives, and then the damage they created. So I just want to sort of think of that idea that when, the 3 takeaways, I guess, would be that we went from a city that was practicing a really extreme form of zero tolerance policing, where we're arresting tons and tons of people, to a reduction in that, which was also gained by the same dirty cops to then target the big dogs that they wanted and that's where the title comes in. Jenkins called these guys monsters, guys that were dealing a lot of drugs or were committing a lot of violence. The police then used that targeting to target people for robbing rather than arresting. And then at the same time, what you really start to see that I think is important for us all to consider, because it really kind of recalibrated some of my expectations on what's it mean to have police officers going after people with guns. I'm really uncomfortable with my own, where I stand on that stuff, just to be transparent. That the idea that maybe going after people for guns is just as problematic and just as unconstitutionally fraught as it was to go after drugs for people. And I don't really know how to reconcile that. But this shift from the war on guns to the war on drugs ends up being kind of the same thing. And you're seeing right now in the city, and you see it all the time, that we every time, Commissioner Harrison will often say, "Hey, I got cops out there aggressively going after guns." Every single, all the top polling mayoral candidates all had some strategy which involved going after guns. The sort of process critique of that is that this was a process that worked that then got out of control because of dirty cops. We just need to fix it. We all can decide whether we buy that or not. But I really, after reporting this book and talking to people jammed up in the system for a gun, or some for having a gun planted on them, I'm really suspicious more and more of this idea that targeting people for guns is the way that we stop crime. It makes sense in theory, but we saw how easily it could be sort of bastardized by dirty police officers, and there hasn't been a lot of real adjustments and oversight over the department since this has happened. The police department kind of still continues to kind of pretend as if this was some thing that happened and now they're all over it, even though officers continue to be in trouble for it, and it continues to cost the city a lot of money. Literally $600,000 was paid out. It was agreed to be paid out today. Okay, so I'm going to run through the questions. I hope this is. If you have any other concerns or questions, just throw them at me. Sorry, this it's very embarrassing. I apologize. I'm trying to get this chat going so I can see the questions better. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. So the first question is, oh wow, a lot of questions are flying. I guess I'll work. Sorry, everybody. Trying to figure out how to answer these questions, but like as you ask more, it shoots me back down to the. Okay, so the first one really quickly about Walter Price. I don't know who killed Walter Price. Walter Price was the gentleman that I mentioned, the picture of Jenkins in front of the van, had the cocaine taken from his house, put it in his van. I don't know who killed Walter Price, and I have to say that I don't feel comfortable even in a panel like this speculating publicly. What I do think I would say is that it echoes certain elements of Soder's death, in that when we started to unpack the story and put all the timeline together, I happened to observe that Walter Price was killed at around the same time that this drug dealer, O. Stevenson, that I mentioned, was subpoenaed and grand juried by the federal government involving this case. So I don't, in the same way that I can't say for sure what happened to Sean Soder, I do know that he was set to testify the day after he was killed. It strikes me as something to just flag, and that's why we kind of just put those moments next to each other, that Walter Price was killed right as people were starting to speak to a grand jury about these dirty cops, and that it's known that the Walter Price case really was a concern of these cops because it had exposed them. But I don't know who did it. I really don't. But that's just something to think about. And that's one of the things I'd say is what we really thought was useful about telling the story, the way we do it as a story in kind of chronological order, closer to something maybe like a novel, where you're thinking, oh, that's all true, written more like a thriller, was that simply by sometimes putting these events next to each other, they really become illuminating, such as the idea of they broke into a condo in Canton and arrested a couple with a fake warrant on July 28th, and on August 1st, a few days later, they're arresting a violence interrupter for not wearing a seatbelt and planting guns on him, as far as he's concerned. And so just putting these information back next to each other really highlights the extent of what they were doing, and highlights the extent of what they're doing, and makes you kind of see the bigger picture and how much was going on. Sorry, I'm trying to read and talk. I'm not good at that. Yeah, I mean, the cops' history of misconduct was pretty extreme, especially Graham, Jenkins, and Herschel. The question was, what were those cops' history of conduct before being placed in this task force? Graham had a series of shootings, including one that was fatal, that during the trial, Gondo said was covered up by the police, that it was essentially shot a guy in the head for no reason. It was covered up by command. Graham robbed someone for $11,000, was suspended for a year. While he was suspended, he was a security guard at Micah. He was collecting his police paycheck as well as the Micah paycheck. And then he was brought back and put in the task force. It's crazy. Jenkins had a long history of the Demetric Simon running someone over, the Walter Price case, which exposed he had lied. Gondo had been shot in 2006 off duty, but it was often seen, made people question why he was shot. We now know that Gondo was working with a heroin dealing crew, so there's more speculation there. So that's just 3 of them. Thanks, Shirley, about the notes. Yeah, I mean, it's really important that this was really deeply annotated. We wanted it to both be helpful for people who were reading it to know where all the information came from, and because we wrote it in a style that's like, really narrative and feels more like a novel or a movie. There's not a whole lot of, as this report said, blah blah blah. And so we want to make sure all that was in the back. So for those who wanted to really dig deeper and also see where it was all coming from, it was annotated. We also wanted to tell this story as sort of narratively and with a lot of momentum, and that was how we came to that. But we really obsessed over the notes. I heard someone said 2 people sent me emails and said they liked the notes were their favorite part of the book. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but I'll take that. So that's something to think about. Yeah, we really, and originally the notes were much longer, and what happened was when we took it to a lawyer, the lawyer was actually like, by cramming so many notes in here, actually introducing more and more questions, which defeats the purpose of the notes. So the notes were almost like a second part of the book in a way, and they challenged some certain people's versions of events, and especially this was helpful for making sure that we honored people who were denying things. Oftentimes, for example, the one officer who spoke to us really denied everything happening to him. He said this was a conspiracy, they never robbed anyone, et cetera, et cetera. I find that incredibly hard to believe. We also thought it was important when you speak to someone who denies to really put their version of events in there. We weren't going to put the version of events in the story because it didn't add up to us, but the notes were really a great place to see what one of the cops was claiming happened. Do you think, the next question, do you think others in the BPD were aware of what's going on if they're not involved? I think they were. I think there's certainly evidence that some people in command knew. Sergeant Keith Gladstone, we mentioned, has been federally charged because of it. Other command were implicated. General D'Souza was implicated as knowing about something, helping cover something up. During the trial, it was claimed that Deputy Commissioner Dean Palmer helped cover up a shooting. What I think is the easiest way to think of it, though, is that what these officers were giving the Baltimore Police Department, even as they were robbing and stealing, was a lot of arrests and a lot of statistics, which were then easily translatable to provide to the mayor and provide to the city and say, "Hey, we're getting, we're out there getting crime, stopping crime." And so there was this tension between wanting these officers are getting a lot of arrests because you can put a lot of arrests on a chart, or you can announce it sounds good. You put a bunch of guns on a table and say, we seized all these guns, and not wanting to know why or how they were getting the guns. The easiest way I'd put it is that the gun trace task force sometimes at night was making up to 50 unconstitutional stops, pulling up on people and just grabbing people off of benches and searching them. So they're getting a lot of guns in really illegal, unconstitutional ways. It's the numbers game, it's like gambling. If you run up on 50 people a night, you're probably going to get a gun. There's no way to do that in a sort of investigatory, proper way. It seems really hard that seasoned commanders in the Baltimore Police Department would be so naive to not wonder how are they getting all these guns? It's kind of impossible to do constitutionally. They kind of look the other way, I think. And so that's kind of, I don't doubt that a lot of this was not known to a lot of people. And as the book kind of shows, Sergeant Jenkins in particular was really good at double and triple crossing people and providing different people with different pieces of information, which made it really hard to report because we were often cross-referencing like 5 different lies to get to the truth. And that's why there's also all the notes. So sometimes we're like, well, here's one lie, here's the other lie, here's this lie. By talking to this person, watching this video footage, this is the version of events that happen. And so I think there's no doubt that Jenkins sort of compartmentalizes crime so not everyone knew everything. But I do think that absolutely any police department would have wondered, how are they getting all these guns? How are they arresting this many people? It's not possible to do constitutionally. Next question. Did they target violence interrupters because they often had criminal records and were very visible? Absolutely. That's something you see in this book a lot, is that people's past is really held against them and used against them. And that really works in court as well. If any of you are on Twitter, I'm sure some of you are on Twitter, there's a Twitter account, Baltimore Court Watch, that has really shown how that's sort of just live tweeting information from court hearings that are happening right now. And what you're seeing over and over again is how often someone's past criminal record is used to keep them in jail or show that they're guilty. And these officers knew that, and knew that if you stop someone, such as LeVar Mullen, the violence interrupter I mentioned, who had been in jail from 2005, 2012 for a murder, LeVar gets out. He's on probation. He's also picked up by Safe Streets because he would be he has this sort of credibility in the community to like learn about shootings and help stop them. People are going to listen to LeVar the way they're not going to listen to the police. That also becomes the thing they use against him. So according to LeVar, they put a gun on him. So then he's faced with a guy who someone who's already been in jail for a murder. He gets out. He's doing violence interruption work. They claim they find a gun on him. He can't really say, hey, as he says in the documentary, which again, you can see a clip of this at the current exhibit. He sort of said to us, and he says it in the documentary, saying, how am I supposed to say, hey, on this one, I did that other stuff, but on this one, I wasn't guilty. It's a really hard thing. But I think the central thing, which I kind of forgot, so thanks for this question, is the core understanding of violence interruption is that you don't cooperate with police. This has been turned into this idea that like, oh, it's a dirty program, it's about stop snitching. No, the idea behind violence interruption is that violence is a sort of contagious disease you have to stop. And it's from a public health perspective. If someone comes up to LeVar Mullen and says, hey, man, this guy did this to me, I'm really mad, I'm thinking about doing something to him, LeVar's job is to talk him down. And in that way, and I spoke to the kind of creator of this model, which is called Cure Violence, which you should look up. It started in Chicago. There's a great documentary called The Interrupters about this stuff. I spoke to the creator of it, a doctor, and he said he compared it to something like, if you go for a doctor's appointment and you get, for example, an HIV test. If someone comes in that doctor's office and said, hey, what did that guy just left? What did he get a test for? Doctor can't say that. So if you see violence as a contagion, as a disease that needs to be contained and treated, you can't provide the information that people gave up willingly to the police. It kind of damages the credibility of the program, and it violates this public health principle. And the program, as I would stress again, has been incredibly effective. It's really shown to really stop violence and stop shootings and help mediation. So to answer the question, why did they target violence interrupters? They target them because they knew about crimes, were not willing to provide the police with information because they can't. And so then they held it against it. So, okay, you can either tell me what you know and violate the entire program, or you can tell me nothing and I'll put you in jail. And maybe in some ways you could see, to their credit, both LeVar Mullen and Albert Brown chose to go to jail over things they said they didn't do, than violate the core tenet of this highly effective program. Okay, the next question is long, but it's a great one. You just called Ivan Bates, quote, your protagonist. That really jumped out to me while reading, and to be honest, was a total disconnect. Maybe he acted or acts in good faith, but casting him as a hero really doesn't jive with his professional history or stated political positions. Everyone else in the book is treated with admirable skepticism and complexity. Seems totally out of step with the moment and potentially dangerous. Comes across as an endorsement of him. Yeah, I mean, you say not trying to be critical, but you totally be critical. Yeah, that's fair enough. My opinion would be that I don't believe that we're definitely not endorsing Ivan, and I don't think we're any more on his side than anyone else in the book. I'm not saying that to downplay what you're asking here, Alex H. I'm just saying I disagree with that interpretation. What I mean protagonist is he's not Wayne Jenkins, right? And I think that without spoiling it, you really get to see, in my opinion, the limits of Ivan's approach in the third part of the book, because you start to see where his politics as he runs for office conflict with some of his previously stated positions. Why we liked Ivan as a main character in contrast to Jenkins was that he was, as he framed it, in a battle with Wayne Jenkins. And I find Ivan to be a really complicated figure, because at the same time that he's going after Wayne Jenkins and these dirty cops, he's representing Alicia White, one of the people that was charged with the death of Freddie Gray. So I find that complexity in him interesting, and shows the sort of conflicts within him about, playing the defense attorney role and then later trying to play the prosecutor role and run for prosecutor. Bates ran for state's attorney against Marilyn Mosby. And spoiler alert, he lost, which is not a spoiler alert because Marilyn Mosby's still our top prosecutor. So I'm glad to talk about this. Or if Alex, if you want to email me or anything, I'm glad to talk about it more. I don't want to downplay it. I also don't want to take too much time on it. But I see what you mean. But I think that for our idea was that Ivan is the sort of version of the conflicted old-time detective in an old crime novel. That's what we're kind of thinking of him. Is like he has a series of complex motivations that sometimes align with what I think some people might see as the greater good, but he's also has these other contradictions and things like that. And so that's why I kind of used him for the exact reasons you're saying, is that he's not a clean kind of hero. We didn't want there to be a hero in the story, I guess what I'm trying to say. And I kind of use that facetiously. And what I mean by protagonist is that Dwayne Jenkins is the mastermind, is really the antagonist, and Ivan is going after him, and by default, Ivan becomes the protagonist. But again, I mean that, like, glad to discuss that or unpack that more, but I don't want to also spend too much more time on it here. Next question. Are these 7 liable to return some of the money they took, plus the money they cost the city? And Wayne Jenkins wants to get out early, according to this thing, because he saved an inmate's life. Yeah, so Wayne Jenkins has been trying to get out of jail for a while now. He made a claim today that Justin reported on Fenton at the Sun, that he saved a man's life and therefore he should be out now instead of in 22 years or whatever. I'm not going to give that argument too much. Not going to too much time with that. The officers are all have to pay a restitution. I apologize, I don't have the exact numbers, but there was a sort of number crunching based on what they stole, who stole what. There's a chart that the federal prosecutors developed, and so they are responsible for that. How they're ever going to pay that back, I'm not sure. And then the central question of these lawsuits that I kind of started with about the city after paying out was the city's basic argument was these officers were operating outside of the scope of employment. Robbing someone for cocaine is not police behavior. So therefore, even if they did it with badges on, dirt on, working hours, the city should not be responsible for that. And that's kind of been this complex debate that's going to keep going. Because more, if you are enough of a wonk to jump into the federal record system PACER and you search any of the cops' names, you're going to see a ton of lawsuits that are popping up every day with these people because they terrorized a lot of people. And so what was agreed upon was that in the cases I mentioned, Mr. James had a gun planted on him and then was arrested for it, and Ivan Potts, who was beaten up and then arrested, that in those cases, because they resulted in people going to jail, they felt more kind of clean and cut and dry as, officers' criminality benefited the city because they put people in jail, and those people suffered from that. And that's why those have been sort of the touchstone cases that you're going to see endless amounts of these cases where people are going to sue. The argument by the city was, we're not responsible for these guys at all, which is hard to square, in my opinion. But you're going to see more cases like this. So these officers and the city are also now responsible for their behavior. What role did FOP play in trying to protect these cops once they're arrested? That's a good question. I mean, the Fraternal Order of Police, as a very, very strong and I think problematic police union, has generally resist critiquing anybody to some extent, including these officers. I mean, they mainly argued for what they're supposed to get as officers. I'm trying to think how to put this quickly. The Fraternal Order of Police protects officers by any means. My biggest example of this when I talk to people about why I think the police union, especially the Baltimore police union, which is incredibly strong, is fraught, is that I understand the unions there to protect its workers, but I could be wrong, but I don't see a lot of other unions that simply deny really crazy degrees of misbehavior by people that are within the union. Like, I remember when sort of Michael Vick, the football player who got in trouble for dog fighting, the football players union protected him and argued for what they felt he deserved as a player and a worker. But they weren't like, oh, he actually did never fight dogs and he did nothing wrong. He's a great guy. And in fact, it's all the dog's fault. That's kind of how the police department tends to take any critique or any lawsuit against police. I think that's kind of the difference. And it really emboldens police. And in terms of thinking about reforms and things like that, which I think is always kind of rolling around all of our heads, thinking about how police unions protect officers by any means, and then also tend to disparage victims and disparage and make it really inconvenient or hard for politicians who critique them to continue to function is a really good example. What role did race play? Did they mostly target? Oh, these are all. I'm going to answer this one, then I might jump down because these are all by the same person. These are all great questions, but I don't want to have your especially because you have about at the most 20 minutes left. I don't know how much longer everyone wants to listen to me talk here. Races. I mean, yeah. There was the dual thing of Baltimore being a majority black city, a city that's incredibly segregated, incredibly racist, which means it puts a lot of black working people out of the proper economy and the underground economy. The deep segregation also makes it easier to sort of go to black communities where one is more able to violate people's rights because of racism and these things. And so that central issue of race is central to what made them arrest these people. There's a quote in the book from Kyle Wells, who was a drug dealer connected to Gondo, the drug dealing cop from the Alameda. And Wells sort of said to us when we asked, like, he said, there's no difference between policing and racist policing. I think that's another way to look at it. And then, you know, something that I've seen people cite that I think it's worth talking about, but I find it a little, I guess, unsophisticated, would be pointing out, oh, most of these officers are black, as if that negates the racism. And it's really that the policing system is dominated by racist ideology and racist styles of policing. That's just not me saying that. That's the ACLU. That's the Department of Justice as well. So that's just something to think about. So also, once you're a cop, you have to sort of do that racist policing, whether you're white or black, and that's going to create those problems. I'm going to jump down, and then if we have more time, I'll come back. Oh, actually, I guess we don't. Okay, here's the thing. If you have any other questions, get them in the next 2 minutes while I'm blabbing and talk about these other questions, or we'll kind of wrap this up. Marilyn Mosby is not treated well in your book, accepting any responsibility for allowing the GTF to get away with. Is Marilyn Mosby not treated well in your book, accepting any responsibility for allowing the GTF to get away with so much for so long? No, I mean, I think something that stresses that Marilyn Mosby, our state's attorney, had nothing to do with these guys being exposed, although as we show in the book, she certainly had inklings that these officers are not on the up and up. Her general response has been that she had been trying to do some things to get these officers exposed. It's really hard to do that. That's undoubtedly true, that it's incredibly hard to expose police officers. But what you see in the book a lot is this sort of irreconcilable thing between wanting to be a so-called progressive prosecutor who wants to do the right thing and understands that the drug war is a farce, that policing is racist, but also having to secure convictions. And those things are really hard to reconcile. That's also, I think, what the Ivan Bates his sort of central psychological tension is between, like, how do I understand my clients while I also think about how we stop crime? What you see with Mosby is a lot of being informed about officers' unreliability and working cases around them. So if 3 officers arrest someone, one of those officers, like Rayam, is known as a liar, you just sort of don't bring Rayam to the trial, you bring the other 2 officers. That to me is a really fraught way of doing it, but it secures convictions. I think that's an equivalent. You have police command who want to secure statistics and put statistics out there, and then you have and once those statistics, hey, we made an arrest today, we arrested this gun. I mean, go on the police's Facebook. To this day, you'll see them put guns up there, say, hey, we got this gun last night. And if you go through the police's history of that on their Facebook, some of the guns they still have that they're touting as they seized back in 2016. One is that guy, William James, who we now know that gun was planted. So there's this propagandistic aspect of the police department saying, hey, we got guns, That's showing results. And at the same time, you have a prosecutor's office whose job is to secure convictions they see by any means. So that's the tension there. So I think Marilyn Mosby, I don't think that, just like I don't think a lot of people knew all of the complexities of this, she was certainly aware that there were some problem officers. And Ivan Bates, Deborah Levy, Natalie Finnegar, and the other defense attorneys in the book are really calling attention to that. But we're limited because they're defense attorneys. Their job is not to prosecute cops. Their job is to try to get their clients a fair trial. Can the family sue them in civil court? Yes, that's happening. Can people victimized by the task force potentially sue the cops? Yes, they can. They're going to try. But they're going to loop in the police department and the city because the city has the money, whereas these officers that are in jail that are already paying restitution don't have that money. How the seven adjusted to prison life. That's a little bit in the book. Herschel was attacked in prison, as described in the book, because of who he was as a police officer. There were rumors that Jenkins was attacked in prison. As someone mentioned today, Jenkins is claiming he saved someone's life in prison, and he should get his sentence reduced from 25 years to 4 years. There's a lot of that kind of stuff going around. We heard a lot. We spoke to some people who were inside with them and used that information in the book. But also a lot of that. It's a weird thing with the book, I guess, because we got a lot of information that's not in there. Some of which because you just can't prove everything you hear, but also out of some extent, some degree of, weirdly enough, like respect for people's privacy. And so there's things about the officers that I've heard that we didn't put in the book, so I'm not going to kind of repeat here. Book's title is very interesting. Could you say a few words? Yeah. So the first robbery in the book is the robbery of this guy for $100,000. After they arrest him and Jenkins realizes he has all this money and all this cocaine, he tells his squad that he's going to go call an officer to sit on the guy's house to make sure no one gets in the house and cleans it out before they get there. But in fact, Jenkins calls his cocaine dealing bail bondsman friend Donnie Stepp. When he gets on the phone, he says, "I got a monster." And Stepp knew what that meant. It meant it was a big drug dealer that would sort of, have a lot of stuff they could steal. So that's where the name of the book comes from. Of course, the book, there's the kind of why we liked it as a title was it has other meanings. It's kind of Jenkins, I think, saying he has a monster. I think that's something you see in the book, is that ultimately Jenkins is the monster. It's sort of the city has a monster, which is this police department. I was really intrigued by the way that we could flip these ideas on their heads, in this story, the cops are the robbers, and the robbers are the victims, and the defense attorneys tend to be the sort of so-called good guys. So we like that inversion of everything. And another inversion that was sort of the language of policing. I mean, we just recently went past the anniversary of Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, his police killing, and Darren Wilson, who shot and killed Brown, really framed Brown as this monster, this guy that had to be shot so many times because he just wouldn't stop. And you see this kind of racist characterization of people of color when they're shot and killed, or when they are always perceived as threats, turns them into these monsters. You hear it, oh, that guy wasn't a good guy because it turns out he had a weed charge. And we like this idea of using that monster word, which it really has been used to dehumanize young black men especially, and use it to expand it and kind of flip it back on some of these cops. So that was there's a lot of sort of these reversals or flips of how you expect a true crime book to go. We wanted to kind of play with this. That's why we want that title. Originally, our editor wanted us to call it Monsters, which we didn't like because our critique of Jenkins's language and police language around monsters is I think it's really fraught to kind of dehumanize anyone, even dirty, horrible cops like these guys, with words like monsters, and we felt that calling them monsters wasn't right. That just didn't sit right with us, and we fought and got the title we liked. Okay. Appreciate your answer. This is Alex asking about Ivan Bates. Does yes. Appreciate your answer to my early leading question. Do you think Trump's DOJ taking over the investigation shifted how federal prosecutors approach this case? Might we have seen more indictments and higher brass implicated in a different political context? This is a great question. And this will be the last call. You got one more minute to ask a question. This is the last one otherwise. Yeah, so this investigation began in late 2015 when Obama was still the president and when the Department of Justice was not under someone as terrible and racist as Jeff Sessions as it was once Trump was elected. The indictment comes down once Trump is in office because the indictment's on March 1st, 2017. The investigation's ongoing through that time, and what we learned from both some people involved in the investigation and also lawyers that were aware of it as it was going on, like Ivan Bates, was there was a real concern that Trump would not be super into prosecuting dirty cops. As we've seen, for example, as his brief attempt to put a goon squad into Portland and bring federal prosecutors and that to bust even more heads, is that Trump seems to think that police in America aren't being tough enough. And so he would probably want to, put Wayne Jenkins back on the street tomorrow if he could. And so there was this tension there. And I also know that Ivan Bates told us a story about how you really saw the shift and how the Department of Justice operated, even from George Bush to Obama. And it was a much more understanding and sophisticated and nuanced department under Obama, although it was still incredibly fraught. Department of Justice under Obama, don't get me wrong. So there was this concern that, like, what if this investigation just gets dropped or anything like that? And I think it had just been so far along by that point and it roped in so many people that at least that initial investigation came through on that they've been working since 2017 that lands on March 1st, 2017. I don't know if it would have been different if under Obama or a more slightly less law and order president that it would have kept going or there would have been more people implicated. My own feeling about it is that there was something kind of really convenient about. Okay. Sorry, as a question, I guess. These are the last questions. Okay, that's it. Sorry. I think that what I think is, and I think the book perpetuates this myth a little bit, is that these officers were all brought down at once because to bring one of them down would have exposed the others and it would have been ineffective. So the initial 7 were brought down at once. It was the best way to do it, on top of bringing down the heroin dealing crew that Gondo was working with on the same day. The byproduct of that was that it kind of isolated the corruption. So now you see more cops being arrested or charged with more crimes kind of trickles out. And it doesn't have the mass effect that we all felt around that time. It was like, wow, 7 officers, And so I don't know if that was to sort of contain it or make it look like it was contained or was just a coincidence. But I do think that another large-scale mass arrest of a bunch of officers at once is probably going to be rare. And I think that has something to do with how the Department of Justice currently operates would like to. I mean, it's interesting to me that, when Jeff Sessions even came to Baltimore at some point into late 2017 to 2018, he wasn't, he didn't mention the gun trace task force. So I came in and talked about MS-13, And so I think there's it's just doesn't politically benefit law and order Republicans to acknowledge that we had a criminal gang operating. And so I'm sure that if they can push that along, they push that off, they will. Michael McConnell, we can talk about that question somewhere else, not because I disagree with you. I think that you're right. Overall, the difference between Obama and Bush's DOJ is minimal, but I do think that you saw the role of federal prosecutors in reducing people's sentences or not going for like as high sentences. Certainly, there's a difference there between, say, Obama's administration, Bush's administration, but I think it's not that clean. Last question. Didn't a do not call certain police officers couldn't testify list exist? Yeah. So really quickly, under previous administrations, there was something called a do not call list, which was a list of dirty cops or cops that couldn't be trusted. And previous state's attorneys used this to not bring incriminating cops onto the stand. I've seen some of these lists. In fact, I saw one that had Gerald D'Souza on it from a long time ago. These were kind of used as a way for and run around a lack of accountability by the police department. The cops aren't going to control their own officers. We're not going to use those officers for cases, and we're going to try to not prosecute cases involving those dirty cops. Mosby, as people have said, has not used one of those. Although now she says she has something resembling, she has a list of cops or whatever. I'm kind of giving you a crappy answer here because I think I'm tired, and also because I am hesitant to kind of put this on a do not call list. I think that that's a great end run around a lack of accountability, but I'm not convinced that it had that, I'm not convinced it had that much of an effect on a lack of accountability. I think it's sort of bigger than a do not call list. In the same way, I think it's bigger than Mosby's office or bigger than the police department, the police unit. It's sort of this group effort, and it's not exposing dirty cops for decades. So thanks, everybody. That was great. I'll tell Baynard you said hi, too.
Okay, thank you so much, Brendan, for sticking in with it and answering all those questions. We also want to let you kind of relax and retire for the evening. The last thing I want to say is reiterate what Brandon was saying. If you would like to order his book, I got a monster. Try to find a local bookstore. Order from them. A lot of bookstores in Baltimore right now have contactless pickup and delivery. So, but definitely order the book. It has way more information. And if you would like to make a donation to Second Wednesdays, I just put the link to the online donation form in chat. So you can, if you'd like to give a donation, it would just support continuing these programs virtually and then again in person when we are able to gather again. So thank you so much, Brandon. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good night.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Later.